In May 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled into dust and Allied forces swept across Europe, an American armored division made an extraordinary discovery in a quiet Austrian village. Hidden on a railway flatbed, battle-scarred and bullet-riddled, sat one of the most infamous vehicles of the Second World War, a massive Mercedes 770 that would spark a decades-long mystery and a case of mistaken identity that would baffle historians for nearly 40 years. This is the story of Hitler's missing Mercedes, a tale of wartime confusion, post-war treasure hunting, and meticulous detective work that would eventually unravel one of the most persistent myths to emerge from the ashes of Nazi Germany. It's a story that involves American GIs, Canadian collectors, museum curators, and ultimately, a German librarian whose obsessive research would change everything we thought we knew about this legendary vehicle. But to understand this mystery, we first need to go back to the 1930s, to the workshops of Daimler-Benz, where German engineering would create the ultimate symbol of Nazi power and paranoia. The Mercedes-Benz 770, known by its factory designation as the W150, wasn't just a car. It was a statement, a declaration of absolute power rendered in steel, leather, and bulletproof glass. When Daimler-Benz began producing these behemoths in 1938, they were creating vehicles for a very exclusive clientele, the leadership of the Third Reich. These weren't mere automobiles. They were mobile fortresses, rolling monuments to the regime that commissioned them. The 770 W150 was, in every sense, engineered paranoia made manifest. Let's talk about the specifications, because the numbers alone tell a story of excess and fear. The car weighed a staggering 4,000 kilograms. That's over 4 tons of German steel. To put that in perspective, a modern SUV weighs about half that. This wasn't a vehicle designed for efficiency or elegance, though it certainly had both. This was a vehicle designed to protect its occupants from assassination attempts, from bombs, from bullets, from the very people the Nazi regime had terrorized. Powering this monster was a straight 8 engine producing 230 horsepower. Now, that might not sound impressive by today's standards, but remember, this was 1938, and this engine had to move 2 tons of armor plating. Despite its weight, the 770 could reach speeds of 150 kilometers per hour, about 93 miles per hour. That's remarkable when you consider what it was carrying. The armor protection was extensive and sophisticated. The doors weren't just reinforced, they were genuinely armored, thick enough to stop rifle rounds. The windows were crafted from bulletproof glass, measuring 2.5 centimeters thick. That's nearly an inch of laminated glass designed to stop bullets while still allowing visibility. Behind the rear passenger seat, engineers installed a mechanism that could raise an armor plate 0.6 centimeters thick, providing additional protection from rear attacks. But the defensive features didn't stop there. Hidden throughout the vehicle were weapons compartments. One was concealed in the dashboard, 2 more in the rear compartment. These held machine pistols, allowing the occupants or security personnel to return fire if attacked. The 770 was designed not just to withstand an assault, but to fight back. Multiple 770s were manufactured by Daimler-Benz for various Nazi leaders. Hermann Goering had one, so did other high-ranking officials. But Hitler's personal 770 was special. It had unique identifying features that set it apart from the others rolling off the production line. Hitler's car featured an ornamental hole in the radiator grille, a distinctive touch. It had 4 vents positioned directly beneath the windscreen. The door hinges, 2 on either side, were arranged differently than standard models. The rear side windows were short and curved, a unique design element. And perhaps most distinctively, the bonnet featured 20 cooling slits on both sides of the central hinge. These weren't just cosmetic differences, they were signatures, unique identifiers that made Hitler's 770 distinguishable from every other Mercedes rolling through the streets of Berlin or Munich. These details would become crucial decades later, but in the chaos of April 1945, nobody was paying attention to cooling slits or window shapes. By late April 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich was in its final death throes. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east. American and British forces were sweeping in from the west. The Nazi leadership was scattered, desperate, or dead. Adolf Hitler himself was trapped in his underground bunker in Berlin, presiding over a disintegrating empire that existed now only on increasingly outdated maps. He would take his own life on April 30th, 1945, but his personal Mercedes had already been separated from him, moved to what the Nazis hoped might be a more secure location. The Obersalzberg was Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, near the Austrian border. It was a complex of homes and offices where Hitler and other Nazi leaders had spent time during the war years, planning campaigns and hosting dignitaries against the dramatic backdrop of the Bavarian Alps. As Allied forces closed in, the SS began moving valuable items to the Obersalzberg, perhaps hoping they could be preserved or hidden. Hitler's Mercedes 770 was among these items. At some point in those final chaotic weeks, SS personnel loaded the massive vehicle onto a railway flatbed wagon. The plan, if there was one, is lost to history. Perhaps they intended to hide it or move it somewhere even more remote. Perhaps it was simply bureaucratic momentum, the grinding machinery of Nazi organization continuing even as the regime collapsed around it. Whatever the intention, the Mercedes never reached its destination. The flatbed wagon, along with its precious cargo, ended up in a railway siding in the small village of Laufen, just north of Salzburg in Austria. There it sat as May arrived, as Hitler died in his bunker, as Germany surrendered unconditionally. The car that had once carried the dictator through cheering crowds in Berlin now sat abandoned on a railway siding, surrounded by the debris of a defeated regime. In early May 1945, elements of the U.S. 20th Armored Division were sweeping through Austria, mopping up the last pockets of German resistance. The war in Europe was effectively over, but not every German soldier had received the memo, and not every unit was ready to surrender peacefully. Sergeant Joe Azzara was leading a squad through the village of Laufen when they encountered resistance. Last-ditch German troops, whether out of loyalty, fear, or simple momentum, opened fire on the advancing Americans. A firefight erupted in the streets of this small Austrian village. The engagement was brief but intense. When the shooting stopped and the village was secured, Azzara and his men began searching the area for weapons, supplies, and intelligence. That's when they made their discovery. Sitting on a railway flatbed in a siding was an enormous black Mercedes, clearly no ordinary vehicle. Even covered in the grime of war and neglect, it radiated power and prestige. The Americans gathered around, examining their find with a mixture of curiosity and excitement. The car bore obvious signs of combat damage. Bullets had struck the vehicle, piercing even the rear armor plate. One round had hit the dashboard. The windscreen showed 3 distinct bullet holes, with spiderweb cracking spreading from each impact point. The right passenger window was badly splintered, the bulletproof glass having done its job, but bearing the scars. Azzara would later confirm that this was the condition of the car when they found it, suggesting that the Mercedes had been caught in crossfire during the battle for the village. Whether German troops had been using it for cover or whether it had simply been in the wrong place when bullets started flying, we'll never know. The Americans managed to get the massive vehicle off its flatbed. They found fuel and attempted to start the engine. After some coaxing, the big straight 8 roared to life, but something was clearly wrong. The engine was damaged, running rough, lacking the smooth power it had been designed to deliver. A Dutch civilian laborer who had been forced to work in a nearby garage approached the Americans. Through a combination of broken English and gestures, he conveyed crucial information. This Mercedes, he said, had belonged to Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering. This identification made perfect sense to the Americans. Goering was the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, commander of the Luftwaffe, and known for his love of luxury and ostentation. Of course, such a vehicle would have belonged to Goering. The identification was accepted without question, and from that moment on, the Mercedes was tagged and documented as Goering's personal car. Nobody thought to check more carefully. Nobody examined the unique features that might have identified the vehicle more accurately. In the chaos of those final days, with thousands of captured vehicles, artworks, and artifacts flowing through Allied hands, one misidentified Mercedes didn't seem particularly significant. Naturally, Sergeant Azara couldn't keep the car for himself, despite whatever fantasies he might have entertained. The Mercedes was far too valuable, far too significant to become an individual soldier's souvenir. Instead, it was pressed into service as VIP transportation for American generals during the early occupation of Germany. The bullet-riddled black Mercedes was repainted green, and white Allied stars were painted on each side, transforming the symbol of Nazi power into a trophy of Allied victory. For several months, it served as a staff car, carrying American brass through the ruins of the Third Reich. In August 1945, with the war in Europe over and attention turning to the continued conflict in the Pacific, the American military decided the Mercedes would be more useful back in the United States. The car was carefully loaded onto a ship and transported across the Atlantic. Its purpose was both practical and symbolic. The United States government organized war bond drives, public events designed to raise funds to support the ongoing war effort and help pay for the massive cost of the conflict. What better way to drum up enthusiasm and donations than to display captured Nazi vehicles? The Mercedes, advertised as Hermann Goering's personal car, became a star attraction at these events. Americans lined up to see the vehicle that had supposedly carried one of Nazi Germany's most notorious leaders. They could see the bullet holes, the splintered glass, the physical evidence of the regime's violent end. It was powerful propaganda, a tangible symbol of Allied victory. For several months, the Mercedes toured American cities, drawing crowds and raising money. Then, its usefulness as a propaganda tool exhausted, it was quietly placed in storage. For 9 years, from 1946 to 1955, the massive vehicle sat in a military warehouse, forgotten by all but a few record keepers. By 1956, the American military was conducting an inventory of captured items. The Cold War was ramping up, budgets were tight, and there was pressure to liquidate assets that no longer served a clear purpose. The Mercedes 770, still identified as Goering's car, was declared surplus to requirements and scheduled for auction. The venue chosen was Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a military facility that regularly conducted auctions of surplus equipment. In October 1956, the Mercedes went on the block, advertised once again as Goering's personal vehicle. The bidding was spirited, but not extravagant. After all, this was a damaged 15-year-old car with bullet holes and a rough-running engine. Its value was primarily historical, and the market for Nazi memorabilia, while real, was relatively small in 1956. When the gavel fell, the winning bidder was H.J. O'Connell, a collector from Montreal, Canada. His winning bid was $2,725. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $30,000. A significant sum, but not extraordinary for such a historically significant vehicle. Interestingly, O'Connell wasn't the only person who went home happy that day. The same auction included another Mercedes 770 captured on the Obersalzberg, this one nicknamed the Blue Goose. That vehicle had definitely belonged to Hermann Goering. It had been captured by the 101st Airborne Division, and its provenance was well documented. But that car's story, as complex and fascinating as it is a tale for another time. O'Connell believed he had purchased a piece of history. Hermann Goering's personal car. He had no reason to doubt the documentation that came with it. After all, it had been captured by American forces, used in war bond drives, and stored by the U.S. military for a decade. The provenance seemed ironclad. H.J. O'Connell arranged for his newly acquired Mercedes to be transported to Rumble Motors in Toronto for restoration. He was willing to invest significantly in the vehicle. After all, this was supposedly the personal car of one of Nazi Germany's most infamous leaders. The restoration team at Rumble Motors faced a challenging project. The Mercedes had been through a war, quite literally. The bullet damage needed to be repaired, the engine required extensive work, the paint needed to be stripped and redone, and countless mechanical systems needed attention after years of storage. O'Connell authorized spending $5,000 Canadian dollars on the restoration, a substantial sum in the late 1950s. The work was comprehensive and professional. Most of the gunfire damage was carefully repaired. Body panels were straightened or replaced where necessary. The engine was overhauled and brought back to working condition. The interior was refurbished and the distinctive black paint was reapplied. However, O'Connell made one crucial decision that would later prove historically significant. He ordered that the shattered windows be left in their as-found condition. The bullet holes, the spiderweb cracking, the splintered glass, all of it was preserved. This wasn't just about saving money. It was about preserving the history of the vehicle, maintaining the physical evidence of its violent final days in Nazi Germany. But the restoration team made a critical error, one that would have implications decades later. Working from photographs and descriptions of other Mercedes 770s used by Nazi leaders, they added a feature that Hitler's car had never possessed: a center-mounted spotlight on a curved bar above the front bumper. This wasn't malicious or even negligent. It was an honest mistake based on incomplete information. Many high-ranking Nazi leaders had this feature on their Mercedes. It seemed like an appropriate addition to restore the car to its original glory. Nobody at Rumble Motors knew that Hitler's specific 770 lacked this feature, that his car had its own unique configuration that set it apart from others. The restored Mercedes was stunning. The black paint gleamed, the chrome sparkled, and despite the preserved window damage, the vehicle looked every inch the dictator's limousine that everyone believed it to be. O'Connell now owned what he thought was a piece of Third Reich history, meticulously restored to near-original condition. For over a decade, O'Connell kept the Mercedes, occasionally displaying it or taking it to car shows. It was a conversation starter, a piece of history that generated strong reactions. Some people were horrified that such a symbol of evil was preserved. Others were fascinated by the tangible connection to history. The car sparked debates wherever it appeared. By 1970, O'Connell was ready to part with the Mercedes. He approached the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa with a proposition. He would donate the vehicle to the museum in return for a sizable tax deduction. The museum, recognizing the historical significance of what they believed to be Goering's personal car, readily agreed. The Mercedes went on public display at the Canadian War Museum, prominently labeled as Hermann Goering's private car. Thousands of visitors passed by it, reading the placard, examining the bullet holes, imagining this vehicle carrying the Reichsmarschall through Nazi Germany. The car became one of the museum's most popular exhibits. But in the shadows of the museum's library, a quiet German man was beginning to have doubts. Ludwig Kosche was a librarian at the Canadian War Museum, a meticulous man with a deep knowledge of military history. Born in Germany, Kosche had a natural interest in artifacts from his homeland's darkest period. When the Mercedes arrived and went on display, he examined it with particular interest. Something bothered him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it at first, just a nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. The car was certainly a Mercedes 770 W150, that much was undeniable. The armor, the weight, the overall configuration all matched. But as Kosche looked more closely, details began to trouble him. He had seen photographs of Goering's known vehicles. He was familiar with the general specifications, of the various 770s produced by Daimler-Benz. And the more he studied the car in the museum's collection, the more discrepancies he noticed. Small things, the placement of certain features, the configuration of specific details, the curved side windows, those 20 cooling slits on the bonnet. These were not standard features on all 770s, and they didn't match what Kosha knew about Goering's documented vehicles. In the early 1980s, Kosha decided to conduct a proper investigation. This wasn't his official job. He was a librarian, not a curator or researcher. But he couldn't let it go. If the museum was displaying the wrong attribution, if thousands of visitors were being given incorrect information, that needed to be corrected. Kosha's methodology was painstaking and thorough. He started with the vehicle itself, conducting a detailed physical examination of every unique feature. He photographed the car from every angle, documented every distinctive marking, measured every component that seemed unusual or non-standard. Then came the archival research. Kosha dove into historical records, examining every photograph he could find of Nazi leaders with their Mercedes vehicles. He studied newsreel footage. He pored over documents captured from Nazi archives. He compared and contrasted, building a detailed understanding of the subtle differences between various 770s. The breakthrough came when Kosha examined the vehicle's engine firewall. On every Mercedes, Daimler-Benz stamped a unique factory serial number. This number was more than just an identifier. It was a key that could unlock the entire history of the vehicle if the right records could be found. Finding those records wouldn't be easy. Germany had been divided after the war. The Daimler-Benz archives had been scattered, some records lost, others captured by various Allied powers. But Kosha was determined. He reached out to Daimler-Benz directly, now operating in West Germany as Mercedes-Benz. He provided the serial number and requested any documentation they might have. While waiting for a response from Mercedes-Benz, Kosha turned his attention to another crucial piece of evidence: the license plate. The original German plate was still on the vehicle, though it was worn and partially obscured by decades of handling and storage. Using careful photographic techniques and lighting, Kosha managed to read the plate. Now he had two pieces of hard evidence: the factory serial number and the license plate number. If he could find documentation for either, he could definitively identify the vehicle. The response from Mercedes-Benz when it came was extraordinary. The company still had records for the vehicle with that serial number. They had manufacturing documents, delivery records, even specifications for the custom features ordered for this particular 770. But Kosha needed more than just corporate records. He needed official confirmation. He contacted the West German embassy, explaining his research and requesting their assistance in verifying the vehicle's identity. What happened next must have been both thrilling and shocking for the quiet librarian. The records told a story completely different from what everyone had believed for nearly 40 years. The license plate number 1A148697 wasn't random. It was a registered personal plate, and the records showed exactly who it had been issued to: Adolf Hitler himself. This was Hitler's personal license plate for his Mercedes 770W. The Mercedes-Benz records confirmed everything. The vehicle had been delivered to the Reich Chancellery on July 8, 1940. The customer was Adolf Hitler. The custom features: the ornamental radiator hole, the 4 vents beneath the windscreen, the unique door hinges, the curved side windows, those 20 cooling slits. All of them matched the specifications in the original order. Every detail Kosha had noticed, every discrepancy that had troubled him, now made sense. This wasn't Hermann Goering's car. It never had been. For 37 years, from the moment that Dutch forced laborer told American GIs in Laufen that the car belonged to Goering, through war bond drives, a military auction, a private collection, and museum display, the vehicle had been misidentified. This was Hitler's car, his personal parade vehicle. The Mercedes that had carried the dictator through the streets of Berlin, that had been used in countless propaganda photographs and newsreels that had represented the height of Nazi power and paranoia. In 1982, the Canadian War Museum officially changed the attribution. The placard was updated, the documentation was corrected, and the Mercedes 770 W150 was finally properly identified as belonging to Adolf Hitler. The revelation had immediate effects. The car's historical value skyrocketed. Public interest intensified dramatically. Suddenly, this wasn't just a high-ranking Nazi's vehicle. It was the vehicle of the Third Reich's absolute leader. The bullet holes took on new significance. The preserved windows became even more powerful evidence of the regime's violent end. But the reattribution also sparked controversy that continues to this day. Some questioned whether such an artifact should be displayed at all. Wasn't this glorifying Hitler, preserving and celebrating a symbol of the Nazi regime? Others argued that the vehicle was an important historical object, that destroying or hiding it would be equivalent to denying history. The museum chose to keep the car on display, but with enhanced context. Educational materials were added, explaining the nature of the Nazi regime, the Holocaust, and the war. The car wasn't presented as a cool piece of automotive history, but as evidence of a regime built on violence, paranoia, and genocide. The mystery of Hitler's missing Mercedes is, in the end, a story about the chaos of war and the importance of careful scholarship. In the frantic final days of World War II, with millions of refugees fleeing, armies clashing, and an entire regime collapsing, nobody had time to carefully document which Mercedes belonged to which Nazi leader. A Dutch laborer made an assumption or repeated a rumor, and that misidentification stuck for nearly 4 decades. It's also a story about the persistence of truth. Ludwig Kosche could have ignored his doubts. He could have decided that it wasn't his place to question the museum's attribution. But his commitment to accuracy, his meticulous research, and his willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led ultimately corrected a historical error and gave us a more accurate understanding of this artifact. Today, Hitler's Mercedes remains on display at the Canadian War Museum, properly attributed and contextualized. Visitors can see the bullet holes, the armored doors, the shattered windows. They can marvel at the engineering that went into creating such a vehicle. But they can also reflect on what this car represents: the paranoia of a dictator, the violence of a regime, and the ultimate fate of the Third Reich. As for Hermann Goering's actual car, the Blue Goose that was sold at the same auction as Hitler's misidentified Mercedes, that vehicle has its own fascinating story involving Elvis Presley, multiple owners, and its own journey through museums and private collections. But that, as they say, is a tale for another time. The lesson here isn't just about one car. It's about the importance of questioning, of verifying, of not accepting received wisdom without evidence. In an era when we're constantly bombarded with information, when claims spread faster than fact-checkers can work, the story of Ludwig Kosche and Hitler's Mercedes reminds us that truth requires effort, patience, and dedication. Sometimes history's greatest mysteries are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the curiosity and determination to look closer, to ask the right questions, and to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it takes 40 years to get there. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.